So welcome everyone to The Wife's Gone, The Kids Are Dead, The Literature of Inquests. Our talk today by author and journalist Gideon Haigh. It is part of Melbourne Writers Festival 2021. We're very lucky to be able to still host this despite physical events not being able to happen this year. I'm Natasha Cantwell, Public Programming and Communications Officer at Public Record Office Victoria. And this talk is presented by Public Record Office Victoria, along with ancestry.com.au. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and all the many lands that we're meeting today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. If you've got any questions, pop them into the chat during the talk, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. So I will now introduce today's speaker. Gideon Haigh has contributed to more than 100 newspapers and magazines and published more than 40 books. He's won Premier's Literary Awards in 3 states, 2 Waverley Library Prizes, and a Ned Kelly Award for True Crime. I'll now hand over to Gideon.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us on this inhospitable day. Inhospitable if you're in Melbourne, anyway. And look, what could be cozier on such an afternoon than a little frolic in public records? Now, this is a bit of an adventure for me. I feel like one of those Victorian explorers speaking to the lantern slides of their expedition. I expect that modern technology is a little bit less forgiving, so please bear with me and my glamorous assistant Natasha from Prov as we try to integrate sound, image and thought. Without further ado, let me take you back 65 years. It's 5:45 p.m. on 11 January 1956. Repatriation Department public servant Charles Lambert pulls into his driveway at 22 Amelia Street, McKinnon. There's no greeting from his wife Eileen, 10-year-old Judith and 6-year-old Charles, although this is a school holiday, so this is not unexpected. He fetches the mail, greets his neighbours, and, as he will recall, approaches the family chicken coop. I noticed from the behaviour of the fowls that no one was about, and believing my family to be out for the day, fed the fowls, collected the eggs, and went by the unlocked door into the kitchen. There I put away the eggs, prepared the water and cups for a cup of tea, which I knew my wife liked when she came in, and fed the cat. Then I used some of the hot water to fit the fittings to a new plastic hose and went to the lounge where I had a glass of sherry and refilled the glass to consume with my meal. I then did some gardening, took some beans to the kitchen, and it was then about 6:30 p.m. This most mundane of domestic scenarios is charged with tension because of its provenance. Charles gives his statement in one of the 223,981 inquests spanning 160 years held on 800 metres of shelf space by the Public Record Office of Victoria. All of a sudden, on an existence hitherto of little note, the state is shining a piercing light. All of a sudden, that stuff of life, never normally documented, sharpens almost painfully. Ooh. That was a bit unexpected. Sharpens almost painfully, sometimes graphically, as this warning you'll find on some files attests, and which I post here just in case, but also often with the drama, the tension, and the pathos of the best literature. Charles Lambert, the solicitous husband who knows how his wife likes her tea, the attentive suburbanite who's aware of his poultry's behaviour, is growing anxious, and we know he's in for devastating news. He goes to the children's bedrooms. He finds his son's room empty, his daughter's room dark. The blinds were drawn. I turned on the light and then saw my 2 children side by side in Judith's bed. They could be asleep, but for their utter stillness. Charles, very distressed, calls the family GP, who will recall his laconic advice: the wife's gone, the kids are dead. The wife is not gone, in fact, as the doctor finds when he joins the police searching the house. I went into the bathroom and found the deceased Eileen Lambert lying in a bath, partly filled with water. She was fully clothed and the water was warm. Her head was out of the water and her hair was dry. There was a hypodermic needle on the window ledge and a glass tumbler on the floor. A suburban bathroom has become a crime scene in the scientific precision of the warmth of the water and the dryness of the hair and the alien presence of the syringe, which leads to the discovery of tiny punctures in the children's arms, the detection of morphia and barbiturate in their blood. The inquest can penetrate no more deeply. It's a ratiocination of the unknowable. The parties stare at paper on which Eileen in crayon has inscrutably scrawled the word torture. Charles's is beginning. He seeks refuge in the mysteries of female reproduction. In his evidence, Charles recalls, "About a year after the birth of my son, my wife entered her menopause, and thereafter until her death, she suffered periodic storms of mental stress of varying degrees of intensity and irrational behaviour, in between which she was a devoted and loving, affectionate wife, mother, sister, and neighbour." For all its quaintness, this explanation enables Charles's continued loyalty to Eileen. "My wife was devoted to her home and was a keen gardener. She was frequently assisting neighbours and friends and was a friendly and lovable person." All he'd noticed, he recalls, around New Year's was that Eileen had grown very quiet and reticent, as though she was under some strain. One imagines the strain of his own future life in that now silent house. Every inquest guarantees a minimum of one death. Every inquest describes a different route, and often a distinctive one, for the coroner concerns themselves with demises that are sudden, unexpected, violent, or otherwise significant. Their value is usually apprehended in socio-historic terms. For the office of coroner predates Victoria. Dr. William Wilmot was appointed by the District of Port Phillip in 1841. It is perhaps the original form of that very contemporary genre, true crime, albeit in a highly distinctive way. We are offered discontinuous, overlapping, taut, and tightly observed narratives in a range of voices: survivors, family members, friends, workmates, police, medicos, their detail almost unbearably poignant, their conclusion often having to stop short of full resolution. Some enigmas remain insoluble, having been prepared, as Albert Camus put it, like great works of art in the silence of the heart. Consider another killer of the same kind as Eileen Lambert, in the category now called family annihilator. After 4 years in the AIF, 35-year-old Robert Parsons worked for the Electricity Commission, was raising 3 children between 6 and 15 months with his wife Florence in Noble Park. The family lived happily together, insisted a witness. He was very fond of his children. Then, one day in 1927, he wasn't. In the words of another neighbour, "I heard some screams coming from Parsons' house. I saw Parsons come out of the house. His hands were crimson as if with blood when he came out. Just as he came out, I saw Mrs. Parsons going towards the door. Parsons followed her, and later I saw the both of them returning to the house. Parsons had his arm around her waist or neck, and she came back without any struggling." Parsons slashed every throat in the home, including his own, for a reason that died with him. The file provides a glimmer of the prevailing social attitudes. The constable commented on the clean and tidy nature of the 4-room house. The table had been set in the kitchen ready for dinner, and a pan with vegetables in it was on the side of the stove, and a small saucepan with egg in it had boiled dry on the fire. It seemed that Mrs. Parsons was a model housewife, as though it might have explained events had she been a slovenly one. There is a letter from a former member of 38th Battalion who, with the reflex protectiveness of the reputations of ex-servicemen, objects to conjecture in the Herald that Parsons' war service has been a factor. The object of my writing is to negative this assertion by stating that Parsons was always regarded as a queer by members of his battalion. His disposition was uncertain and was addicted to romancing. For instance, he would always maintain he was born in England, where his papers showed he was born in Wagga. Shifty, always shifty. But the file was sealed and sent off, and I dare say that nobody troubled to look at it in the 94 years before I ordered it a few weeks ago at the Public Record Office. Not every inquest is of a murder, of course. Accidental death is by far the largest category, notably house fires and road accidents, with the coroner being encouraged to findings that may prevent future deaths, even if the detail is all of the period. On 22 November 1931, 15-year-old farmer's son, Charles Alcorn, was playing cricket near Devenny, and he was hit on the head by a full toss. Today, one suspects, a protective parent would sweep their son away. Charles rubbed his head, exclaimed, "Gee, that got me a beaut," and carried on batting. Then, when the game was over, rode his bike 2 miles to play tennis. There, he started vomiting, but carried on playing with the insistence that he was all right. A cerebral hemorrhage would kill him within 24 hours. On 24 February 1951, a Bonds tourist bus was taking a circuitous route through country Victoria from Melbourne to Adelaide. It had stopped overnight in Ararat, had stopped for lunch at Hall's Gap. At about 3:50 p.m, it was proceeding through Horsham at about 20 miles an hour. The passengers, in high spirits, had been singing. Now, driver Reginald Forbes was using a microphone and amplifier to point out places of local interest. He had noted the Temperance and General Building, Noakes's flour mill, and just told the passengers to look out for Horsham High School on the other side of the Dimboola Road level crossing. There were no gates there, no lights, not even a sign. He looked to the right and saw nothing. He looked to the left and was momentarily blinded by the afternoon sun. As he crossed the tracks, he became aware of the looming shadow of an N-class goods locomotive whose whistle he had not heard. 2 passengers looked up from the books they were reading. One said, "My God, look out." She was one of 11 passengers killed as the train carried the bus 40 metres down the line. The passenger next to her survived. Looking at the bus, I'm astonished that anyone survived. I was reminded of Atta Egoyan's film, The Sweet Hereafter, partly inspired by 1989's Alton bus accident in Texas, where nearly $200 million in damages were paid to the families of the passengers killed. The film's main character, a big city lawyer who hustles a town's inhabitants into a class action, says crisply, "As far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as an accident." But in Victoria in 1951, there still was. The police thought Forbes candid, truthful, and cooperative, and the coroner returned a finding of death by misadventure. Every now and again, we hear from the dead themselves, confused, despairing, anguished, angry. In 1913, Isabel Newman of Paran had 5 children of her own between 11 and 23, but had also taken to what was called baby trafficking, adopting babies, frequently illegitimate children, for money. Then, the body of a baby turned up on the beach at Carrum, wrapped in newspaper, and Isabel was denounced by an anonymous informant and swept up in the investigation. Pretending to dress before accompanying police to the station, she hurriedly scribbled this: "My dear husband and children, forgive me for what I've done. I am innocent, but evidence is against me. God forgive me and help you in the hour of your need, your loving wife and mother." The last words: "My husband and children do not know anything but that I am getting 10 shillings per week to look after a baby. That is all they know. So help me God. I, Newman." Then she took strychnine, which she had hidden in her blouse. I would sooner die than face the courts again, she explained with her dying breath. There is so much we would wish to ask, but it is too late. Likewise of Richard Wardell Père et Fils, who mingled honour with their self-destruction. Richard Wardell Sr. was the maker of Australia's first-class century. 6 years later, discovered embezzling money from the Victoria Sugar Company, he drowned himself in the Yarra, leaving behind the following suicide note. I have gone to the Yarra. It is best for all. Richard Jr., only one at the time, inherited his father's sporting prowess, captaining Melbourne to its first VFL premiership. He also inherited his father's self-annihilating tendencies. He stepped in front of a train in Elstonwick in 1929 with the following note in his pocket. Dearest one, this is farewell to you, for I cannot live. My love is not as strong as yours. I am unworthy and dishonoured in your eyes. His head was found 25 yards away. His wife was given the original of the note, but was not called at the inquest. Perhaps it was felt that the family had suffered enough. In April 1934, 40-year-old mother of two, Martha Turner, went with her Boilermaker husband to a dance in Oakley Town Hall, where she became convinced that people were sending her secret signals. A spiritualist confirmed that her husband was in on the plot and had her under surveillance. Her husband's account of coming home at 6:20 p.m. a week later is like a ghost story by M.R. James. I went to the front door. It was locked. I looked for the key in its usual hiding place behind a post. It was not there. I went to the back door. It was also locked. I rattled the door. No one answered. The house was in darkness. I went to the front gate and leant on it, looking down the street. I remained there for about 5 minutes when I heard footsteps in the passage of my house. I walked to the front door and found it unlocked down an inch or so. I opened the front door. The passage was in darkness. I switched on the passage light and I saw my wife walking through the hall curtains. She did not speak and I did not speak to her. I followed her down the passage. When I got to the end of the passage, I heard the sound of a fall. Martha Turner had just slashed her throat, having beaten her children to death, leaving behind a note on scrap paper. After being followed all day, I seek to die with my children. She did not die, in fact, for another day in the hospital, composing a fuller farewell. I have been follow about all day, both going to be work and going home. My husband had somebody watching me and I'd done no wrong. I have been to spiritualist meeting and my husband was going to leave me with 2 children. I was demented over an incident at a dance with my husband at the Oakley Memorial Hall. They all made signs as they passed me. I could not see myself left with 2 children and nowhere to go, so I went and done us all in. Sometimes, because these inquests concern our state and our cities and towns, a story will make us look anew on the familiar. On the night of 28 August 1938, a 23-year-old drifter, James Henry Hunter, accosted a 61-year-old pensioner, James Bishop. They grappled. Bishop, at length, strangled Hunter with his own shirt collar. The police photographed the scene. The scene is today unchanged, except that in this photograph, I've stood in for the detective. I've walked this path into Faulkner Park to play cricket 100 times and more. I'll note this patch of ground in future, like Mark Antony. Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth. Sometimes the story contains a bitter twist. In March 1959, Norman Rich left the family home in Bentley to live with his mistress, leaving behind wife Joan and children Catherine and Geoffrey. 11 days before Christmas, Norman scheduled a plumber to pay a visit to the family home. The plumber arranged for Joan to leave the house open for his early morning arrival. Then something went wrong, familiar to anyone who has dealt with a tradie. "I was due to be there at 8 a.m, but was unable to get there," said the plumber. "I subsequently arrived at the address at 5 to 4. As he arrived, he noticed Norman Rich at the gate, having been to the children's school from which he had intended offering them a lift home, only to find them not there. The house was locked and sealed. It turned out that Joan had sedated Catherine and Geoffrey, then opened the faucets on the gas range until they'd all asphyxiated. Joan had taken a long time to die, long enough to type 2 lengthy suicide notes addressed to her brother Harvey, also contemplating the possible impact on her elderly parents. Her reasoning was that living took more courage than dying. Under the gas's influence, the second note grew less coherent, more repetitive, increasingly wretched, and strangely hypnotic. I should have done what I have for the children. They were never frightened, Harvey, never. I gave them sedative when they went into their own beds, and later, when they were heavily drugged, I dragged them out here. Katie was very heavy, but I can assure you that they were never frightened. The gas is quite pleasant. I am now a murderess. Would you please go to Jeff's funeral? He really loved you. If only there was some way I could give me to you. They are sleeping now, and I am heavily drugged, so it won't be long. Jeff had a little present for you, Harvey, something he bought himself out of his own pocket money, which is 1 and 6. He was concerned you would not receive it. It was terrible trying to pretend everything was all right, but they are good kids and readily took their sedative. They were in their own beds, Harvey and Mimi. They did not know what I have planned. I rang Norman again, but he was out. Poor Norman. Please try to help him, but don't let him come to my funeral. I did a terrible thing. Norman did not want children, and I insisted on these 2. I honestly thought he would grow to like them, but he didn't." Her last thought? "Which reminds me, will you please also look after our ginger cat? If you cannot take him with you, please have him painlessly destroyed," which presumably was what she felt she was doing to her own children, which she would have been unable to do had that plumber turned up when he'd promised. The knowledge that tragedy lurks in so many files does not render some easier to bear, such as the tangled tale of Lawrence and Nanette Flanagan. The file is unusually comprehensive because Nanette was trying, through the family court, to extract herself and their 4-year-old son Paul from Lawrence's suffocating grip. Lawrence and Nanette married in 1970, but Lawrence, a mechanic, was a heavy, violent drinker. The couple separated thrice, twice on the advice of a marriage counsellor at Catholic Family Welfare to forgive and forget. Nanette reconsidered. The third time, after a campaign of sustained physical and mental violence, she was resolved. But she had first to leave their house, which is here, presenting the world a benign suburban face. Finally, on 15 August 1977, Nanette contacted police at Glenroy. She stated that she had been having trouble with her husband. He had refused to allow her to use her motor car, to use the telephone, and to take her son out of the house. She stated that she had been assaulted by her husband on a number of occasions, but she did not wish to make any complaint at that time. What she wanted was for police to attend the next morning at 4 Chris Court, Oak Park, so she could get her car out of the house that morning safely. Law enforcement present at a domestic confrontation. It's a couple of years after The Removalists, which David Williamson says he based on a true story. The real life police handle this rather better, but there is still an edge to the narration of Constable Graham Payne. I met Mrs. Flanagan outside the house as arranged. We all went into the house where I saw Mrs. Flanagan. I told him the reason for our presence in his house and I requested the keys to Mrs. Flanagan's car. He stated that they were in the position they always were. Mrs. Flanagan then went into the kitchen and took the keys off the top of the fridge. Mrs. Flanagan then collected her son and also got some clothes for him. We then went outside and Mrs. Flanagan put her son in the back seat of the car. Mrs. Flanagan then got into the car. Mr. Flanagan then went around to the passenger side front door and went to get in the car. I stopped him from getting into the car and shut the front door. Mr. Flanagan stated he had a right to go with his son and that he would report me for my actions. Mrs. Flanagan then drove the car out the drive and left. Nanette's version for the family court adds telling, rather chilling detail. That when my husband saw the police enter the driveway and ring the front doorbell, he ran away. I let the police in and they looked for my husband. My husband had hidden in the toilet. He came out when the police requested him to do so and said that he did not have my keys and that they were on the refrigerator. That I took the keys and left the house to drive away, but my husband had locked the garage door. He opened it at the request of the police, and when I got into the car to reverse out of the driveway, my husband got in the car and refused to get out. He said that he would follow me. When the police requested him to get out of the car, he told me that there would be nothing left to come home to. The next 11 months were a legal and emotional tug of war. Lawrence trying to straighten himself out with the church's help, Nanette trying to protect Paul from his father's intense possessiveness. His son, Lawrence believed, was destined to be a champion athlete. Nanette's own lawyer put it to her that perhaps Lawrence had changed. In fact, Paul appears to have been as terrified of Lawrence as Nanette, to the extent that in July 1978, she sent him to live with her parents in Swan Hill. When Lawrence came to remonstrate, she tried something else. Having perhaps had a sense of her husband's fear of the police, she told him she was in love with a constable in Fawkner by the name of McMahon. Subsequent inquiries revealed there to be no such person, but Lawrence's rage boiled over and he strangled her. Except for Nanette's body, the crime scene photos could be of almost any 1970s interior. Copies of the Herald and the Women's Weekly, a space heater under a mantelpiece bearing baby photos, television, stereo, armchair. On this armchair, Lawrence's self-pitying note. He complained that he had been provoked, claiming that he had changed when his actions had just amply belied it. Honestly, he said, no one knows what I've been through. He was never to be questioned about it because he threw himself off the Napier Street overpass onto the Tullamarine Freeway. When Flanagan versus Flanagan resumed the following day in the family court, Justice Frederico opened tactfully. In the matter of Flanagan, I was informed by the registrar that both the husband and wife became deceased overnight. The bland officialese of became deceased as though describing the termination of a contract. In fact, the raw stuff of this doomed 1970s marriage still has the power to shock. What we now know of domestic violence, it could be a headline from today. like the best literature, it feels like it really happened. And that is because it did. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Gideon. Powerful stuff, isn't it?
It is. It is amazing. Why would you bother making stories up, frankly, when there are stories as good as this, as profound and shocking and dispiriting, but also kind of strangely fascinating as these?
Seeing if anyone's got any questions. People are saying fascinating. It's the details that really bring it to life. A great selection of investigations. Thank you. We're all stunned. Okay, here's a question. Do you ever find something in the inquest that are just too graphic?
Certainly, I found some extraordinary things in Prov files, which testify to the strange sort of to that aspect of record keeping, which is the desire to keep absolutely everything, which is only to be commended, quite frankly. Let's not throw this out. Let's just put it in the file and send it away, because someday someone might want this. And actually, I must say that that record keeping in Victoria, I think from my comparative research in other state archives, is really good. It's of a very high standard. You often find in other archives that record series have been destroyed or lost or have been poorly managed and are now inaccessible. Not in Victoria. I've had a very, very high success rate compared to, for instance, I've done stuff in New South Wales and Queensland in the last year, and it's very hit and miss in those places. I remember when I was researching The Racket, which is a book I did on the history of illegal abortion in Victoria. I did a pretty deep dive into abortion-related deaths, which are very fascinating to study through time, because you get a very strong sense of a kind of a secret subculture, a secret exchange of information about abortifacients, effective abortifacients, and also the sheer loneliness and isolation of women facing unplanned pregnancies in days gone by. And I can remember one, I think it was in Benalla in the 1940s, where a woman had decided to abort herself using particular soap, a soap solution, and to administer it, she had used a bicycle pump, and the bicycle pump valve was still in a plastic pocket in the file,
Wow.
which just completely did my head in. And then there was another one which I wrote about earlier this year, where a young woman, Irene Argent, died during an illegal abortion, and she was identified by her dental records, and it turned out that her teeth were in an envelope in the Inquest file. I guess, what are you going to do? What are you going to throw them out?
Wow.
Put them in the file. I literally was reading the Inquest and thinking, what's this little white envelope here? Oh, I know what it is. I know what it is. And there it was.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of people wouldn't realize that there are often objects in these files as well.
Yes, yeah. A few years ago, when I was doing a scandal in Bohemia, I was studying a rape case, and there was the court transcript in the file and all the necessary legal documentation. But then there were 2 vaginal swabs that were wrapped in copies of the day's Argus, which obviously had been put away in case anyone in future wanted them.
Wow. Okay, we've got tons of questions now, so we're moving on to, how many inquests have you read?
Well, I think the very first records I read would have been about 30 years ago, and they were kind of incidental. They were incidental to more general inquiries. I decided to start looking just in case I could find additional detail. And in those days, you had to trek out to Laverton. Perhaps people who've been using Prov for a while will remember that long trek with those very irregular bus journeys and the very, very long waits to get documentation. I reckon I've read 500 or 600 by now, and any book that allows me to delve into them, I welcome. It's not that there aren't great other record series. Divorce papers in Victoria are also fabulously interesting. I've also read quite a lot of asylum records because I find the works of the mental health system in Victoria to be deeply fascinating. But there really is just nothing like a good inquest. I know that makes me sound ghoulish, but I'm hoping that I'm among friends today.
We've got another question. Love to know what happened to the man in the first case. Was he guilty?
This is Charles Lambert. Oh no, it was his wife who did them in. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And it struck me as very poignant, actually. I wondered what happened to Charles Lambert in the rest of his life. I mean, you can imagine what it must be like to live in a house where your wife has died and taking the two children with them. And that's why I was very moved by his statements at the inquest. There was still a kind of a residual sense of loyalty to his wife. He explained her monstrous behaviour by reference to her menopause. He was looking for a reason to explain it. He wanted to excuse her. He wanted to understand it. He wanted to turn it into something that he could appreciate in his own language, as inadequate as that must have felt.
What's another question here? Do the inquest files routinely contain full addresses?
Yeah, they do actually, yeah. And sometimes it's quite fun to go and look up the address because you can immediately sort of find it on Google Maps these days, Google Street View. I've done that a few times. You go, I wonder what the scene looks like now. And in fact, that's what I did when I found that one in Faulkner Park. I thought I recognised that backdrop. So I went to Google Street View and I pivoted around until I could see the backdrop. And I thought, well, it hasn't actually changed. If I stand there in the same place, I'll recreate that photo. The only disappointment was that I didn't manage to persuade my daughter to stand in the photo, which was the original plan. I had to do it myself. She took the photo.
Are there any restrictions to photographic evidence that might be deemed too violent and not included in the files?
I don't know about that. There was actually an inquest that I went into when I was doing the research for this paper, and it was a very, very gruesome killing. It was a wife in the 1980s who had stabbed her husband and 4 children to death, and as utterly transfixing as I found it, and I couldn't in all conscience use it today. I actually drew my own moral line in the sand there. It was a very, very ugly investigation. I'm not even sure that you'd want to share it in a book. I mean, photographs ask no questions and tell no lies. They are absolutely unsparing. So I think if you do go searching in the in inquests, you have to be prepared for what you find, and you also have to be prepared to exercise a modicum of restraint.
This question here I can answer. How do you gain access to your state's department files? I assume this person is asking how you gain access to the inquest files through Prov's website catalogue. If you create an account with us, you can then go to our reading room and view the files. So everyone has access to the files that you've been using.
For this particular paper, I really just did a random walk through the inquests. I sort of thought, that looks interesting. I'll just order up those and I'll see what I can do to link them all together. Because there is an incredible randomness and chance about inquests, and no 2 people die in precisely the same way. But the challenge is to kind of see through the inquest and to understand what it is that you're looking at. This very instantaneous, very intimate slice through time. You're going right back into the living room, into the bedroom, into the park, as it was at that particular moment. And then immediately you're zooming out again and you're taken back to the present. You're given this tiny little aperture through which to view this savage act from the past. And there's something really compelling about that. It's the stuff of the best crime writing, in fact.
Mm. This person wants to know if you've written any fiction, or would you?
No. Answer that question. I think that, I mean, I've been a journalist for 37 years. And of course, at school, like a lot of kids, I wrote lots of stories and, I loved exercising my imagination. But I think the minute that I got involved in journalism, I realized that the real world contained stories much, much more interesting and much, much more bizarre than I could ever possibly come up with myself. So in fact, I'm further away from fiction now than probably at any stage in my life.
And this person wants to know how you got initially interested in the Inquest files.
I think I had reason to go out and look for the inquest of a cricketer in 1990. It was an Australian cricketer called William Midwinter who died in the Kew Asylum, and I'd heard that there were such documents, but I'd never sought to correlate them. In those days, it was quite laborious. Not only did you have to hike all your way to Laverton, but the actual indexes were in the city. You actually had to go to the city, go through a card file and get an index number, then go out to Laverton, hand that over, and then wait for the 2 deliveries a day. But in due course, it came up, and it was absolutely fascinating. I used, I remember I used inquests in my book, Mystery Spinner by Jack Iverson. Jack Iverson was an Australian cricketer who had a brief comet-like career in the early 1950s, and then many years after the fact, committed suicide in his back shed in 1973. And I can remember, this is actually an interesting story about serendipity. I went out to Laverton to get the inquest file. And while I was waiting for the inquest file to come back, I began to leaf through, perhaps some people who regulars at Prov will remember it. There were these big sort of lever arch folders that told you about the other record series at Prov. There was no online catalogue in those days, of course. You basically blundered around in there and no one ever helped you. But I happened to open at random a page that drew my attention to a record series called The Index of Defunct Real Estate Agents. And I went, well, Jack Iverson was an estate agent. I wonder if there was a file for his firm. In fact, not only was there a file for his firm, but there had been for his father's firm. And it provided me with a whole host of additional information. I would never have discovered it if it hadn't been for the 3-hour wait, all the time I had to kill before the inquest came up from the bowels of Laverton.
This person asks, have you ever found things that made you think that you needed to follow it up or speak with the police?
The police? Well, certainly. I mean, in the case of that Iverson inquest, I saw the names of the police on the file, and I thought, I wonder if they're still around. And I got in contact with the police, and I guess in those days the police were quite helpful with the media. But they said, oh yeah, there's one's at this country station, one's at the station in North Melbourne. And I rang them both up and I asked them what they recalled about the investigation. And one of the police recalled very vividly walking into the living room of the house and looking around the walls and seeing all the sporting trophies and thinking, oh, this man's actually quite important. We better take care in this particular investigation. So you both got the inquest and a kind of a real-time recapitulation of the putting of the inquest together.
So we've got a question here. How does Prov retain these files? So they're permanent records, so they will be retained forever, would be my answer. What else have we got? I think the purpose of the inquest is to ascertain the identity of the body as well as the possible cause of death. Is that so?
Yeah, I mean, often you get the case where a body is identified. There's a reasonable portion of bodies that have never been identified, both of adults and infants, and sometimes identification is impossible to prove.
Mm. Will there be a recording available? Yes, there will. Everyone that's attended will receive a recording, hopefully tonight. I'll send it through to everyone. This person asks, are some records closed? I've been trying to find inquests and court records for a case in the 50s where the father murdered his children and tried to commit suicide and failed. He was placed in a place for the criminally insane.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, that might have become a criminal trial brief, and sometimes that happens. That actually happened in the case of Molly Dean, who was the subject of my book A Scandal in Bohemia, who was murdered by an unknown assailant while she was walking home in Elwood. Now, it had actually been widely assumed that inquest had been destroyed or got lost or even been stolen and hidden. And there was a bit of a conspiracy theory built up around it. The assumption was that she had been killed by someone who needed to hush up the circumstances of the death. In fact, what had happened was that when at the end of the inquest, it was recommended that charges be laid against a particular man, and the inquest became the criminal trial brief. So it moved from the list of inquests to the files of the Office of Public Prosecution. And it happened that I thought, well, it's not here. It's got to be somewhere. So I went through the index for criminal trial briefs and I found it there. Of course, in those days, it wasn't easy to copy things. There was often one copy of something, and if it wasn't one place, it had to go somewhere else. You didn't necessarily make an extra copy. You just simply moved a copy from one place to another. Mm-hmm. I suspect that's behind a lot of documents that have gone astray, that they've become the preserve of prosecutors as a result of the inquest investigation, but maybe that there wasn't a conviction recorded, or in this case, the man was declared insane and unfit to stand trial.
Yes, because just to add to that, inquest files, we have them available to the public up to 1985. So yeah, so other types of files are closed, but yeah, the inquests are generally open up to 1985. Someone wants to know, Helen Morgan wants to know, what is your moral line?
What's my moral line? Well, my mother's in the audience out there, and I would like to confirm that I was very well brought up, and I think if my mother was to find something too shocking or too dismaying or best left alone, I'd probably take the same attitude.
Good answer. Someone asks, are these inquest materials all available online? Do you have to just go to pub? No, you can.
No, they're not. Some are, and if you wanted to take a sample of inquests, you can get quite a few online. Now, I don't know what proportion are available at a click, Natasha. What would it be? I don't think it would be huge.
No, I don't think so.
If you wanted to familiarise yourself with the genre, you can definitely, let your fingers do the walking.
Yeah, but if you want to do some proper research into inquest files, you will need to come back when we're open up again, but hopefully soon. If there is an inquest, shouldn't there also be a death registration? I have one but cannot find the other.
That's interesting. Okay. Do you have the death certificate? And does the death certificate usually states whether an inquest has taken place? That's often how I get a start on things. I'll look up a death. I'm a bit of a certificate hunter. If I'm doing sort of biographical research on someone, I want all the certificates related to their life, including, their birth, death, and their marriage. And often you'll find on the death certificate that an inquest was held, and then you think, you beauty, let's go.
Do you ever link the inquest to the newspaper reports or subsequent court cases?
Oh, all the time, all the time. And Trove is absolutely wonderful in that respect. You know, the inquest doesn't have to speak only for itself anymore. You can instantly correlate it with the way in which a case has been covered by the daily media. Sometimes it's surprising, though, the number of cases that the newspapers never got around to reporting. I mean, you would have thought it was an absolute guaranteed source of newspaper titillation, inquests, but often they are covered even quite cursorily in period newspapers.
This person wants to know about your articles. Where can they find articles that you've written? They know about your books, but they want to know about your articles.
I write for The Australian, for better or worse, and I write for The Times. I do a bit here and a bit there and write books, and Google me. Google me. It's random, but it'll get you a selection. I do actually have a book coming out later this year called Shelf Life, which is a collection of some of my long form journalism, which has been published in places like The Guardian, The Monthly, Meanjin. So a small and modest project, but it did help keep me going during lockdown.
We've got a question. What are you working on at the moment? Have you done anything since then?
Oh, yeah.
New projects?
All the time. Well, my most recent book is a book called The Brilliant Boy, which is a book about Doc Evatt and his career as a jurist and as a public intellectual in the 1930s and 1940s. The next book I'm doing, which is which I'm publishing myself actually, is actually another archival quest. It's a book called, actually I'll hold up the cover here. The title is "The Night Was a Bright Moonlight and I Could See a Man Quite Plain." I'll read you the blurb. On the night of 23 September 1910, on a station 500 kilometres west of Brisbane, farmhand John Neal was beaten to death with a cricket bat. The prime suspect, George Vernon, was the fresh-faced 24-year-old son of one of England's most famous amateur cricketers and part of an Australian rural dynasty. The murder trial became one of Queensland's most sensational, for Vernon did indeed harbour a secret, but not a secret anyone suspected. And the crime was to have a shocking sequel. Okay.
I love it. You must find every cricket/death related thing you can find.
It did bring together two of my great interests, which is cricket and violent death, and this enabled me to research in Queensland State Archives, which I mean, I'm biased here. They're just not anywhere near as good as Prov. I'm not just saying that for you, Natasha.
Thank you.
They were okay. They're okay. They helped me out, but it took a little bit longer than I'm used to. Anyway, it is a great story, and I'll be publishing it in the next month or so when the books come back from the printer. And if you follow Russell Jackson on Twitter, he will be doing the needful out there. So because I just find Twitter too confusing for my analog brain.
You going to tell us about your Inquest book?
Look, I'm thinking. There's nothing like a bit of a bask in Inquest to get the creative juices flowing. But I've got a few things to get sorted out before then, including another cricket season, which seems to be on us almost before we're ready for it. Assuming that we ever get any cricket, we might actually spend the entire summer talking about how we're not going to get any cricket.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. If anyone wants to put in their final questions. I probably skimmed over a few. We had so many at the beginning. I'm sorry about that. If I missed your question, you can put it through again.
Thank you to whoever's posted my bibliography there. Kerry Firth, very kind of you. It's long, but and it's in reverse chronological order because I'm too stupid to do it any other way. But you can find a guide to my my previous publications there.
Cool. Okay. A final request. It doesn't look like we've got any more, so I would just like to say thank you. Oh, okay. Can we please have the link to the recording? Yes. We will. I will be sending it out to everyone. So if you've registered, if you're here now, you will receive a recording, so you can all listen again.
Look, thanks very much for coming today, folks. I know this was meant to be part of the Melbourne Writers Festival, and it was disappointing that that couldn't go ahead. But look at it this way: we probably would have got 20 people in the hall at the.
We were because of COVID restrictions. We were only allowed 21 people.
About social distancing in cyberspace. So it's been great to have you all today.
Yeah, it's been fantastic that so many people can. I mean, the amount of work that you put into this talk, to have only 20 people would have been such a shame.
And thanks very much to Natasha. Natasha's joining us today from New Zealand. She's patiently waiting for a possibility of a flight back to Australia. So thank you very much to her.
Thanks, and thank you so much, Gideon. It's been absolutely fantastic and heaps of fun. Who would have thought that such a gruesome topic would be so much fun?
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, everyone.